We're on the Admiral's Hard, a site that's been scarcely changed for hundreds and hundreds of years. You can see behind some of the stonework from the harbour walls, many robbed from local structures, probably some of even the medieval town walls which surround the south end of Stonehouse, which still survive today. This ferry, you can see today, the people are still queuing to cross the short distance of the Humose to Kreml and the Mount Edgecombe area. Today it is replaced with tourists and sightseers and day trippers to go and enjoy the summer sun over in the park, whereas this has been in use for some 700-800 years in the same sort of style. People were rowed to and fro across the Humose through the very strong currents for people to go and trade, exchange trade, goods with Plymouth itself and Stonehouse, and then over to Mount Edgecombe, which was part of Devon back in its day. This site is more than just a crossing. It has been the site for activity for the last 2,000 years that we know of. The Romans themselves came up the Tamar. We know this with finds at Coalstock, but they would have had to pass this section. And the astonishing part is that coins, offerings to the gods, and even a villa itself were found just about where the Princess Yachts building is today. Beyond the building, there was the access up into the creek, Stonehouse Creek, or Deadpool as it was known. The bridge now crosses over, but it was open, and on the tidal creek you could row up the river. This was one of the reasons why this section of water was favoured by the Admiralty for resting ships between going out to sea and refitting. They were stripped of guns and powder, and many were used as prison ships, or known as hulks. One such ship was recorded in the 1770s. It was a 1776 ship called the Dalton, which was an American ship. America had recently declared independence of the Crown, and this ship was captured and taken to Portsmouth. The men were stripped of clothes and belongings and told that they would soon follow behind them, and they came down to Plymouth. This was one of the first ships to be brought here with prisoners of war from the American Wars of Independence. One man aboard the ship was called Charles Herbert. He secretly recorded a diary during his captivity, which is an amazing eye-opener into life in the 18th century in Plymouth. He records his time of ships passing to and fro, the salutes of the ships, and the transferring between different ships as they were refitted and sent to sea. They would be moved to the next ship. Life was hard and cold. There was not good food, and they suffered. They were visited often by locals from Plymouth, and the Americans were quite surprised at the reactions of the locals. One captain's daughter was very surprised when they spoke and said, "They're almost like us and they use our words." She couldn't believe. She was expecting almost like a monkey person. She's forgetting that these were our ancestors, these were distant cousins of ours, and they were as English as some locals were. The locals gave gifts to these prisoners. They gave them clothes, coin, they gave them food. They looked after them. Many captains dug into their own pockets and bought these men food and clothes and made sure they were looked after. This surprised the Americans. They hadn't been called Americans. They were referred to as rebels, which they did not like. They seen themselves as Americans. When the men inevitably grew ill, many with fever, they were put on ships, on small rowboats, and were taken up the creek. This was a tradition known as being taken up the creek, and they were taken up through into what's now the parks, in between the DHS for boys, Denport High School for boys, right in front of Stoke Damrell Church, which wouldn't have been there at this period, but the Royal Naval Hospital opposite, which was a fantastic and modern building, which most modern French hospitals were built upon, this sort of foundation. It had 10 massive blocks, each with 6 wards to serve many, many men. Up to 1,500 men could be served in these modern hospitals with nurses, modern treatments, or what was then groundbreaking treatments. They were treated exceptionally well. They were given good food, they were given fresh clean clothes, they were given treatments which Charles Herbert managed to record, which is an eye-opener. It's the only known surviving record I know of which opens the eyes of early 18th century medicine, especially in the city. Charles Herbert mentions about the conditions he's in. He mentions about the treatments that they received under certain guards and officers. Some would be harsh and see them as sort of subhuman, often referring to them as rebels. Some would treat them very fairly, almost equals, and they were often given gifts and money, and in exchange some prisoners offered skills to local carpenters and tradesmen. They would make furniture, they would make trinkets which were sold locally by these carpenters. Many men recovered from their time in the hospitals and were then transferred to the purpose-built Mill Bay Barracks. This was in part due to many fears of prisoners escaping, getting amongst local people and maybe creating an uprising, but Mill Bay Barracks were converted into a prison, or Mill Bay Gaol was brought into use to serve as a purpose-built prison, land-based, and these men were taken ashore. And Charles Herbert was one of these men who built a trade while he was there, making furniture and fine sort of what we would refer to as antique furnitures nowadays, some possibly still surviving in the city without us even realising. These men had a hard time. Some returned home, some never returned home. The very freedom that they stood to fight for and independence, they never got to see. They never returned home. They died on the King's land, many in unmarked graves, some in the very waters behind us. If they died on ship and they weren't an officer, they were simply wrapped and cast overboard, forgotten to both time and living memory.